There were 61 coils of rope in Sweetwater County that summer, and 60 of them were wrong. Nobody knew that. That is the whole difficulty with this story, and I want to put it in front of you before anything else happens, because everything that follows is people behaving reasonably on the information they had. Nobody was lying. Nobody was cheating anybody. A man sold rope that he believed was good rope, and men bought it believing the same thing. And it hung on nails and pegs and wagon hooks all over that county through the summer of 1886, looking exactly like what it was supposed to be. And one woman knew. She had known since the second week of June, when the first bale came off the freight wagon, and she walked into the mercantile and put her hand on it. Her name was Verity Milan. She was 33 years old. She was a big woman, and had been all her life. And she made rope. Let me tell you what that meant. Because most people now have no picture of it at all. Behind her house, on the flat above the creek, there was a rope walk. It was a strip of level ground 900 feet long, with a low shed at one end and a set of posts down the length of it. And it was, in the plainest sense, a factory that happened to be outdoors and to have one worker. Rope is not woven, and it is not braided. Rope is twisted, and then the twist is twisted the other way. And the whole thing holds together for exactly one reason, because every part of it is trying to untwist itself and cannot, because everything around it is trying to untwist itself too. A rope is an argument that has been going on so evenly, in so many directions at once, that it has turned into an object. To lay a rope, by hand you walk it. You walk the yarn out the full length, you walk back, you walk it again. A 600-foot coil of 4-strand manila took Verity Milan 9 days. And in those 9 days, she walked something in the region of 40 miles without ever leaving a strip of ground you could see the ends of. That is what she sold. 9 days, 40 miles, and a thing that would not come apart. She had learned it in Kentucky. Not from her father, who was a cooper and who thought the whole business beneath her, and not from her mother, who died when she was 11. She was apprenticed at 14 to a rope-walk master named Elias Penhale, a small, bad-tempered Cornishman with a cast in one eye who had laid rope for ships before he ever laid it for farms, and who took her because she was strong and because nobody else would work for what he paid. He taught her the way men like that taught. Badly, harshly, completely. He taught her that you can tell more about a rope by the sound it makes running through your hand than by anything you can see. He taught her that the enemy is not weight, and it is not use. It is water, and after water it is the sun, and after those two it is a man in a hurry. And he taught her the thing that mattered most in the end, which was how to lay a rope you could account for, yarn by yarn, from the bale it came out of to the coil it went into. She was 19 when he died. She had his tools, his book, and no rope walk. And it took her 11 years and a marriage and a widowing to get one. By 1886, she had been laying rope on that flat for 4 years. And Sweetwater County had got used to her the way a county gets used to anything, which is to say, it had stopped looking. Now, the rope that came off the wagon in June. It was machine-laid, and it came out of a mill in the east, and it arrived in Denton Fife's mercantile at a price that made no sense at all. Verity Milan sold her 4-strand at 14 cents the foot. The eastern rope was 7. Half, exactly half, near enough, for a rope that looked, and I want to be precise here, because this is why nobody caught it, a rope that looked absolutely identical. Same color, same lay, same hand. Put a foot of hers and a foot of theirs side by side on a counter, and 99 men out of 100 could not tell you which was which, and the 100th would be guessing. More than that, brand new, it tested the same. That is the part that undoes everybody. If you had taken a new sample of each and pulled them apart with a tackle and a spring scale, they would have gone within a few percent of each other. And the eastern rope might well have won. The difference did not exist yet. It arrived later, because the eastern rope was hard laid over a short fiber core. The long, clean fibers were on the outside, where the light fell on them, and where a hand ran over them. Inside, under a very tight twist that held everything in place beautifully as long as nothing disturbed it, was short stock, and short stock does one thing when it gets wet and then dries: it moves. It moves a fraction, and a hard-laid rope has no room for anything to move a fraction. Get that rope wet once and let it dry once, and it lost something in the region of a third of its strength. A third. Not visibly, not audibly, not in any way you would ever find unless you were looking for it. And here is the cruelty of it, the thing that kept the whole county blind for 3 years. When a rope parts, nobody blames the rope. They blame the man on the end of it. He rigged it wrong. He had a bad angle. He shock-loaded it. He ran it over a sharp edge. Every one of those things is a real cause, and every one of them happens. And every man who has ever worked with rope has done all of them at some point, and so when a rope goes, there is always a perfectly good explanation standing right there, holding the end of it. Looking foolish. Verity Mullen put her hand on that bale on the 2nd week of June, and knew inside about 4 seconds. Not from looking, from the sound. She ran 3 feet of it through her closed hand, the way Elias Penhale had made her do 10,000 times before he would let her touch a spinning wheel. And it made the wrong noise. A dry, fine, whispering sort of noise instead of the low-grade one she expected. She stood in that store with her hand on a bale of rope, and she understood, completely, that every stock chute and gin pole and picket line and well rig in that county was about to be hung on something that was going to be 2/3 of a rope by the following spring. And there was, at that exact moment, absolutely nothing she could do about it. I want to sit in this for a minute, because it is the engine of the whole thing. She could not prove it, not in the way people mean when they say prove. There is only one test that tells you what a rope will hold, and it is this: you take the rope, and you pull on it until it breaks, and you read the number off the scale at the moment it lets go. That is the entire science. It has not changed. You cannot test a rope without destroying the piece you tested. So think about what that means for a woman standing in a store in June 1886 with a bad feeling and a good ear. To show a man that the eastern rope fails, she must break a piece of the eastern rope. Fine, she can buy that at 7 cents. But breaking it on its own proves nothing at all, because a number by itself is meaningless. 1,400 pounds sounds enormous. Is it good? Bad? Nobody in that county had the least idea what a rope of that size ought to hold, because nobody had ever had a reason to find out. To make the number mean anything, she has to break a known rope beside it. Same size, same day, same tackle, same everything, so the 2 numbers can be set against each other. And the known rope has to be one she can account for absolutely, or the whole demonstration is worthless the moment somebody says, "Well, how do we know your sample was ordinary?" She had exactly one rope like that in the world. 600 feet of 4-strand, laid the previous autumn out of the last bale of long sisal-grown stock she ever got from the Penhale supplier, the mill that had shut in 1879, and whose remaining stock she had bought in one lot and hoarded for 7 years. She could account for every yarn in it. She had the bale marks. She had her own book, in her own hand, kept the way an unpleasant little Cornishman had taught a 14-year-old girl to keep it. It was the best rope she would ever make, and there would never be any more of it. Each break test would take 40 feet, 20 for the sample and 20 for the tail and the eye splices, and the pieces are not reusable afterwards. Because a rope that has been loaded to failure is finished as rope whether it parted or not. 600 feet, 40 feet a test, 15 tests, and 14 if she wanted to keep any of it whole. That was her entire supply of proof for the rest of her life. 14 demonstrations, and there was no way on earth to make more, because the stock did not exist anymore. And a rope laid out of different stock proves nothing about the rope laid out of this one. I have told a good many stories on this channel about people who could not get anybody to listen. This is not that story. Verity Milan could get people to listen. She could show any man in that county, in his own yard in about 40 minutes, with a tackle and a spring balance, exactly what he was buying. She just could not do it more than 14 times, ever, and every man who folded his arms and said, "Well, show me then," was asking her to spend a piece of something she could never replace. That is the whole shape of it. Hold on to it, because everything from here runs on that arithmetic. She spent the first one on the 4th of July, not on a crowd. That is the thing people expect, and it is exactly wrong. And she knew it was wrong. Because Penhale had told her once that a demonstration in front of 40 men convinces nobody, and a demonstration in front of 2 convinces 2. She spent it on Royce Tolliver and his uncle, who ran the freight outfit. Because the freight outfit was the biggest single buyer of rope in the county, and because Royce Tolliver was 29 and curious, and had asked her a real question about splicing once. They came out to the walk on the afternoon of the 4th mildly, expecting to be politely bored. She had rigged a horizontal pull between 2 of her walk posts with a set of blocks and a spring balance from the freight scale, which Royce had brought himself so that nobody could say afterwards that her scale was crooked. She had 2 lengths of rope, both 5/8, both spliced the same, both eyed the same. One was hers. One had come off the bale in Fife's store 3 weeks earlier, and had been soaked in the creek for a day, and dried in the sun for 2, which is exactly what happens to every rope on every ranch in that country roughly once a week. She broke the eastern one first. It went at 1,180 pounds, with a crack like a shot. And Royce Tolliver jumped, and his uncle laughed at him. Then she broke hers. It went at 3,240. Nearly 3 times. Not a little bit better. Not a matter of opinion. Not a difference you could argue about over a stove. Royce Tolliver stood there for a while. Then he said, "Well," and then he did not say anything else for some time. And then he asked whether she could do that again, and Verity Milan said no. She said it flatly and without drama, and she showed him the coil and the book, and she explained the arithmetic, and I do not think either of those 2 men fully understood that afternoon what she was telling them. She had just spent 1/14 of everything she would ever be able to prove. On them, in a yard, on a holiday afternoon. Because she thought they were worth it. They believed her, both of them. Completely and immediately. And here is what happened next, which is the part that would make anybody tired. Nothing. Royce Tolliver went back to the freight yard and told them. And they said, "Huh." And the outfit went on buying the eastern rope. Because the outfit did not buy rope, the uncle's brother-in-law bought rope. And he bought it at 7 cents because he bought everything at the cheapest number on the list. And that is how a freight outfit works, and how nearly every outfit that has ever existed works. Belief is not the same as procurement. She learned that in a single afternoon, and it cost her 40 feet. The second test she spent in September, on Sheriff Arlo Beam, for reasons that were entirely sound, and which came to nothing at all, and I will come back to that. By the end of 1886, she had 520 feet left and 2 believers, one of whom bought no rope and one of whom had no reason to. And then, in the March of 1887, in the Mercantile in front of 11 people, Denton Fife said the thing that this whole story is named for. I want to be fair to Denton Fife as well, because it would be very easy to make him the villain, and he was not one. He was 51. He owned the store. He had 3 children and a mortgage on the building. And he believed genuinely, without any dishonesty at all, that the Eastern rope was the same rope for half the money, and that a man in his position had an obligation to sell people the same rope for half the money. He also, and this is the part that is harder to be fair about, thought Verity Milan was a joke. Not a wicked joke, the comfortable kind. The kind a man makes about a woman in a store when she is standing 12 feet away, that he would tell you afterwards was not meant unkindly, and that he would be genuinely surprised to hear had landed. She had come in to ask him, one more time, whether he would carry her rope alongside the Eastern rope, not instead of it. Alongside it, at her price, on her own consignment, so that a man who wanted one could buy one. And Denton Fife leaned on his own counter and looked at her, and looked at the 4 coils of hers he had taken 2 years before, and never sold. And he said, to the room rather than to her, "Everything that woman makes is too heavy." And the room laughed. It is a small sentence. Read it again. It is doing 2 things at once, and every single person in that store heard both of them, including her, including him. Her rope was heavier than the Eastern rope. That part was true. And it was true because there was more fibre in it, which was the entire point, and which was the reason it held 3 times what the other one held. He had turned the single best fact about her work into the reason nobody should buy it. And he was talking about her body. In front of 11 people. On a Tuesday. That is what she was up against. Not villainy. A man being funny at a counter. Now here's the part I want you to watch, because it is the hinge of her entire character, and it happens in about 90 seconds. She did not answer him. She bought what she had come in for, which was lamp oil. And she paid for it, and she said good afternoon to 2 people on her way out. And she went home. And 4 days later, at the stove in the back of the harness shop, where 5 men were sitting out a snow squall, she said it. Once, she said the Eastern rope was short-fibre core, hard laid, and lost about 1/3 after a wetting, and that it would be parting on people inside 18 months, and that she had broken the 2 side by side in her own yard in July, and had the numbers written down. There was a silence of the particular kind, and then Ivo Marsh, who was a decent man and who liked her, said, "Now, Verity, don't." 2 words and a name. That is all it took. He was not being cruel either. He was doing what people do, which is to spare somebody the embarrassment of continuing. He heard a big woman who made expensive rope explaining that the cheap rope was bad. And he heard it the way the whole room heard it, which was as a person talking about her own interest and dressing it up as a warning. He was telling her, kindly, to stop before she made it worse for herself. She looked at him. Then she said, "All right, Ivo." And she did not say it again for 3 years and 2 months. Not once. Not to a single soul. Not when it would have helped her, not when she was asked directly, not when it might have made her a sale. If a man came out to the walk and asked her whether the Eastern rope was any good, she said she had no opinion on other people's rope and offered him 14-cent rope at 14 cents. I have thought about why, and I do not think it was pride. Or not mostly. It was the 520 feet. A woman who goes around a county saying the store's rope is bad becomes immediately and permanently a woman with a grievance. And a woman with a grievance can break rope in her yard all day long, and it will convince nobody, because everyone already knows what she is trying to prove, and that is precisely the reason to discount it. Her evidence was finite. It was 13 more tests, forever, and the value of each one of those tests depended entirely on her not being the woman everybody expected to be making this argument. She was not being proud when she went quiet. She was protecting the only asset she had, which was the possibility of being believed once, later by the right room. So she went quiet, and she laid rope. And she sold about a third of what she needed to sell, and the county went on hanging things off the eastern rope. And the wet and dry cycles went round. And the strength came out of every coil in Sweetwater County, a little at a time, all through 1887 and 1888, silently the way rust happens. And then, things started to break. Let me take you back to Kentucky for a few minutes. Because you cannot understand the woman on those courthouse steps without understanding what a bad-tempered little man did to her between the ages of 14 and 19. Elias Penhale had a rope walk outside Paducah, and he had come to it the long way round. He was Cornish. He had laid rope for ships at Falmouth as a boy, and ship rope is a different trade from farm rope in one crucial respect, which is that when ship rope fails, people generally drown. He had brought that across the Atlantic with him, and he had never put it down. She was 14 when she went to him. Her mother had died when she was 11, and her father was a cooper who thought a rope walk was no place for a girl, which it was not. And he let her go anyway, because there were 4 younger than her, and one less mouth was one less mouth. Penhale took her because she was already big for 14 and strong, and because he paid $2 a month and a bed in the loft, and nobody else would take that. For the first 3 weeks, he did not let her touch anything. He gave her a length of yarn, and he made her run it through her closed hand. That is all. Hours of it, sitting on a bench outside the shed pulling yarn through a fist, over and over while he worked. She thought for most of those 3 weeks that he was simply making her suffer to see if she would leave. She was 40 years old before she fully understood what he had been doing. And she said so, and here is what it was. A rope tells you everything about itself through your hand, and it tells you nothing at all through your eyes. Fiber length, twist, evenness, damp, tar, wear, damage under the surface where you cannot see it. All of it comes up through the skin of a closed palm at about 2 feet a second. But you cannot learn that on good rope and bad rope side by side, because you have no baseline. You have to learn what ordinary feels like first, so completely and so boringly that it becomes the thing your hand expects. And then, ever afterwards, wrong announces itself. He was not testing her patience. He was building the instrument. That is why she knew, in June 1886, in about 4 seconds, with her hand on a bale in a store, in front of nobody, with no scale and no test and no evidence of any kind. Her hand had 19 years of ordinary in it. The rest of what he taught her was more practical, and it was all of a piece. He taught her the lay. A rope is yarns twisted into strands one way, and strands twisted into rope the other way, and the whole argument between those 2 directions is what makes it an object. Twist it hard, and you get a rope that is stiff, that sheds water off the outside, that holds its shape beautifully, and that has no room inside itself for anything to move. Twist it soft, and you get a rope that is heavier for its size, that takes longer to make, that does not look as smart on a shelf, and that can breathe. He laid soft. Always. He would not lay hard for anybody, and he lost work over it. And he told her that a man who wants a hard rope wants a rope that looks good, and that he should go and buy one somewhere else. He taught her that the enemy is water, not weight. Weight is nothing. A rope is enormously strong in the direction you pull it. Water gets inside, and then it dries, and everything inside moves a little. And every time that happens, the rope is slightly less than it was, and the only defense is fibre long enough to have somewhere to go. He taught her tar, and how much, and when. Too little, and the rope drinks. Too much, and it goes stiff and the fibres cannot move at all, and it breaks itself from the inside over 3 years, which is a thing that happens and which almost nobody knows about. And he taught her the book. That is the last thing, and it is the one that ended up mattering most. Every bale that came in, where it came from, when, what it looked like, what it made. Every coil out, what went into it, what it was sold as, to whom. She asked him once, at about 16, why it mattered, since nobody ever asked. And Ilias Penhale said, because one day one will. That is the whole of it. That is the sentence that put a 33-year-old woman on a set of courthouse steps in Wyoming 17 years later, with a book she could open and a bale mark she could point at. He died in 1875 when she was 19. There was no rope walk to inherit. It was rented ground and the landlord had other plans. And there was no money. And what she got was his tools and his book and 5 years of a trade nobody in her family thought was a trade. It took her 11 years to get a walk of her own. She married at 22 to a man named Hollis Milan, who brought her out to Wyoming. And he was, by everything I can find, a decent enough man who died of nothing interesting in 1883, and who does not otherwise figure in this story. She kept his name, because changing it back would have been a piece of admin she had no time for. The 900 feet of flat above the creek was hers, because he had bought it for the hay. She put the walk on it in 1885, alone, over 5 months. And the posts she set that year were still standing when she died. Now, why 9 days for a 600-foot coil, when a mill in the east could turn out 600 feet in about 40 minutes? Because every one of those 9 days is a step you cannot compress. The yarn has to be spun, and it has to be spun evenly, and evenness in hand-spun yarn is a function of how fast the spinner walks backwards. And a person can only walk backwards so consistently for so long before it goes off. The strands have to be formed, and they have to rest. That is a day on its own, doing nothing, just hanging. The laying itself is one long day of the hardest physical work in the trade, walking atop and 4 strands the length of the walk against a rising twist that is trying to take the whole thing out of your hands. Then it rests again. Then it is stretched. Then it is stretched a second time, which is the step everybody skips, and which is the step everybody skips, and which is the reason her rope did not go slack in service. You cannot do that in 40 minutes. You can do a thing that looks exactly like it in 40 minutes. And that, in the end, is what the entire story is about. And it is why a county could not tell the difference for 3 years, and why 31 men blamed themselves. Because the difference between 9 days and 40 minutes is completely invisible. It is not visible on a shelf. It is not visible in the hand of anybody who has not run yarn through a closed fist for 3 weeks at the age of 14. It is not visible new, and it is not visible at 6 months. And it is not visible at a price list where one number is 14 and the other is 7. It becomes visible exactly once, at the worst possible moment, with a load on it. The first one was a gin pole at the Ordway place in April 1887. A gin pole is the simplest lifting rig there is. A long spar stood up on end, guyed off in 3 or 4 directions, with a block at the top. You use it to set a windmill, or to lift an engine, or to put a ridge beam where a ridge beam has to go. Every ranch had one or could put one up in a morning. The Ordways were setting a new tank tower. The pole was 32 feet. The guy on the north side parted about 4 feet above the anchor, while there was 700 pounds hanging in the block, and the pole went over sideways and took the half-built tower with it. And a man named Feldkrister got a broken collarbone out of it and was extremely lucky, that was all. Nobody said one word about the rope. Why would they? The guy had been rigged by Feldkrister himself, who was 22 and in a hurry, and there was a perfectly visible reason for it to have failed. The anchor was a wagon wheel buried on its side, and the rope had been passed round the rim. And the rim had a burr on it. Everybody looked at the burr. Everybody agreed about the burr. Feldkrister apologized for the burr for about 2 years. I want to be clear that the burr was real. It was there, and it was sharp, and it had certainly not helped. But a sound rope of that size, over a burr, at 700 pounds, does not part. It gets a nick in it, and you cut the nick out, and you swear at yourself, and you carry on. That is the ordinary lesson every rigger learns in his first season. And it is the reason a burr is a thing men laugh about afterwards, instead of a thing men die of. The rope that parted at the Ordway place was 14 months old and had been rained on perhaps 40 times. The second was in June at the stock chute at the loading pens, where a rope used as a running gate line let go and dropped a gate on nothing in particular. No harm at all. Somebody spliced it and forgot about it inside a week. The third was a well bucket at the school section in August. The rope parted about 20 feet down, and the bucket was lost, and the county paid $2 for a new one. The fourth was a picket line in September that let 6 horses loose overnight, which is more serious than it sounds, and which cost 2 men 3 days of riding. And so on and so on and so on. I have a list. It is not a complete list. Because nobody was keeping one, which is exactly the point. Between April 1887 and June 1889 there were, that anybody afterwards could name, 31 separate ropes that parted in Sweetwater County under loads that had no business parting them. 31, spread over 26 months, across a county the size of a small state, on 20-odd different places, in 31 unrelated pieces of work, each one with its own perfectly good explanation, standing right beside it, holding the frayed end and feeling stupid. That is what a slow failure looks like from the inside. It does not look like a pattern. It looks like a run of bad luck and a lot of careless men. And every single one of those men believed it was his own fault, and said so, and went on believing it, some of them for years. That is the thing I keep coming back to about this story. It is not that the county was being robbed. Nobody lost much money. It is that 31 men were each quietly carrying a small private conviction that they had been careless, and not one of them was. Now, back to Verity Milan, who was watching all of this from the flat above the creek and saying nothing at all. She kept a book. Of course she did. Because Elias Penhale had taught her to keep a book when she was 14. And by 1889, keeping a book was as automatic to her as breathing. But her book from those years is not what you would expect. And when I first understood what was in it, I had to sit back from it a minute. It is not a record of the failures. She wrote down 4 of them, early on in 1887, in a plain hand with dates. And then she stopped. There is a gap of 18 months in that book, where a woman who was watching her own prediction come true, over and over, in public, wrote nothing down at all about it. I think I know why, and I want to put it to you carefully. Because it is either the most self-defeating thing in this story, or the most clear-sighted, and I have gone back and forth on it. A list of other men's broken rope, in her handwriting, was not evidence. It was a motive. Picture it. She stands up in front of the county with a book. And the book says, here are 31 ropes that failed, and here are the dates, and here are the men. What is the first question? It is not, is this true? It is, how long have you been keeping this? And the answer is 2 years. She has been walking around this county for 2 years, writing down every time a man's rope let him down, while selling her own rope at double the price. There is no version of that which does not look like a woman building a case. Everything she had, all of it, depended on her being a woman with 600 feet of rope and a scale and no axe to grind. The moment she became a woman with a list, the demonstration stopped meaning anything, because everybody would already know what she was trying to prove. So she watched 31 ropes part, and she kept her mouth shut, and she did not write it down. And her rope sat in the shed, and she sold, in the whole of 1888, 4 coils. 4 coils. That is 36 days of work sold in a year. She lived that year on garden produce, on $11 a month from a boarding house laundry contract that Wennecobb gave her mostly out of kindness, and on the sale of a mare she should not have sold. Let me tell you about the second test, the one I set aside earlier. Because it belongs here. In September 1886, she spent 40 feet on Sheriff Arlo Beam. It was a considered decision, and it was, on paper, a very good one. Beam was 58. He was widely trusted. He had no financial interest in rope of any kind. And he was the closest thing that county had to an official who could say a thing and have it stick. He came out. He watched the whole thing. He was, by every account, genuinely impressed. And he stood there afterwards turning the parted end over in his hands and shaking his head and saying that was a considerable difference, wasn't it? And then he asked her what she wanted him to do about it. And Verity Milan discovered, standing in her own yard with 40 feet of her irreplaceable rope lying broken at her feet, that she had never once thought that part through. What could he do? There was no law being broken. Denton Fife was selling rope that was exactly what it was advertised to be, which was rope. There was no standard, no specification, no mark. Nothing in statute that said a rope had to hold anything in particular. The county had no rope inspector, because no county on earth had a rope inspector. Beam was sympathetic, and he was honest with her. He said that if a man came to him and said the rope he had bought was bad, he would have to tell that man it was a matter for a civil suit, and that a civil suit would turn on expert evidence, and that the only expert in Sweetwater County was her, and that a court would take about 4 minutes to notice she was a competitor. Then he said the sentence she remembered longest, and he did not say it unkindly. He said, "Verity, you have shown me something true. I do not have anywhere to put it. That is a real thing, and it is worth sitting with." She had spent an irreplaceable seventh of her evidence to convince a man who then had nowhere to take the conviction. Being believed had bought her nothing at all. 520 feet left. 2 believers. Nothing changed. She did not spend another foot of it for 2 years and 8 months. Think about the discipline in that. Think about how many times between September 1886 and the summer of 1889 somebody must have said something at a counter or across a fence that made her want to go and get the tackle. 31 ropes parted in that county in that time. She heard about every one of them. And 31 times she made a decision not to open the shed. Her whole life she had been told she was too big and too slow and too expensive. And the one asset she had left was that nobody had yet decided she was the sort of woman who goes about proving things. Now I have to tell you about Royce Tolliver's wrist, because that is the middle of this and it is the moment she nearly broke. He was 29 in 1886 when he stood in her yard on the 4th of July and watched a rope go at 1,180 pounds. He was 32 by the summer of 1889, and he was running his uncle's freight outfit, and he had never once forgotten what he saw. He had also never once managed to change what his outfit bought, because the buying was done by a man in another town on a list of prices. On the 9th of June, 1889, he was loading a boiler section onto a heavy wagon at the depot with a set of skids and a snatch block. And the fall line parted, and the section came back down the skids, and his left hand was between it and the wagon bed for about a quarter of a second. He kept the hand. He did not keep the use of the wrist, not properly, not ever again. And he did what all 31 of them did. He said out loud, in front of the men who had helped him load it, that he had run the line at a bad angle over the edge of the bolster, and that it was his own doing. He was 32 years old, with a wrist that would not turn, apologizing for a rope. Verity Mullen heard about it 2 days later at the boarding house from Wennecobb. And here is the moment, here is the actual hinge of this whole thing. And it is a very small physical fact. Somebody had hung the parted fall line on a nail behind the harness shop. That is all. It was hanging there, both pieces of it, with the failure ends together, in the open, on a nail, where anybody walking down the alley between the harness shop and the feed store could see it. Nobody had put it there for any reason. Men hang broken things on nails. She walked past it on the 12th of June, and she stopped. Because on that nail was the one thing she had never had. Not her rope. Their rope. A failure that had already happened, in public to a man everybody liked, with the broken ends still on it, that she had not gone looking for, and had not paid for, and had not touched. If she took it, she could put it under a glass in front of any 5 men in that county, and show them the short core. It would not even need a brake test. The evidence was already broken. She stood in that alley for a while. And then she left it on the nail and walked home. I have thought about that decision more than any other part of this story, because she was right, and it is infuriating that she was right. The instant Verity Mullen is seen taking a piece of another man's broken rope off a nail, she becomes exactly what 3 years of silence had been protecting her from being. She becomes the woman who collects. And the moment she is that woman, the rope in her hand is not evidence, it is something she went and got. And every single person in that county will be able to see it that way inside a heartbeat. Because it will be the obvious way to see it. Worse, it would have made Royce Tolliver's wrist into her exhibit. A man she liked, who had believed her for 3 years, who had just been hurt, and who was walking around telling people it was his own fault. She would have been standing on him, so she left it there. And it stayed on that nail, in the rain and the sun, for another 5 weeks, going quietly worse, until somebody used it to tie a gate. That was the low point. And it did not feel like a low point at the time, because low points rarely do. It felt like an ordinary Wednesday in June in which she walked home and did some washing. Here is where she was in the summer of 1889. She was 33. She had been laying rope on that flat for 7 years. She had 520 feet of provable rope in a shed, 13 demonstrations left, and no room in the county worth spending one on. She had sold 4 coils in the previous year. She had a mare fewer than she had started with. 31 ropes had parted. 1 man was permanently damaged. Every one of those men thought it was his own carelessness, and 2 people in the world believed her, and neither of them bought rope. And then, on the 30th of July, Denton Fife walked out to the flat above the creek and offered her the best money she had ever been offered in her life. I want to walk you through 4 of those 31, slowly, because the pattern only becomes visible when you see how completely reasonable each one was on its own. Take the school section well. In August 1887, the well at the school section was 61 feet, and it had a windlass over it with a rope and an oak bucket. Every child in that district drank out of it, and every teacher hauled it up 6 or 8 times a day. The rope parted about 20 feet down on a Tuesday morning with a full bucket on it. Nobody was hurt. The bucket went to the bottom and stayed there. The teacher that year was a man named Cornelius Peavy. He was 26. He wrote to the county about it and asked for $2 for a new bucket. And in the letter, which survives because county letters survive, he apologized. He apologized for the rope. He wrote that he was aware he had been hauling too fast and had let the bucket strike the side going down, and that he would take more care. He had not been hauling too fast. He had been drawing water out of a well like a man draws water out of a well. But he had noticed himself doing it a bit quick once or twice, the way anybody notices anything about themselves. And when the rope went, he reached for the nearest thing he had done wrong and put it in a letter to the county, in writing, in his own hand, at the age of 26. That letter was in a file drawer in the courthouse the whole time. It was 40 feet from where she pulled his rope apart in 1889. Take the picket line in September 1887. A picket line is a rope run between two posts that you tie horses to overnight when there is no corral. It carries almost nothing. A horse leans on it, a horse pulls back on it a bit, that is all. It parted in the night at a branding camp, and 6 horses walked off, and it took 2 men 3 days to get them all back. And one of those horses was never found at all, and turned up 5 months later, 30 miles away with somebody else's brand on it, which caused its own separate trouble. The man who had strung that line was a hand named Guthrie Nall. He was 19, and a picket line is the one job where there genuinely is a way to do it wrong. If you set it too tight, it has no give, and a horse that spooks against a tight line can part it, and every old hand will tell a young one to leave some sag in it. So Guthrie Nall spent about a decade being the man who set the line too tight. He was not. It has some sag in it in the only photograph that includes it, taken 3 weeks earlier for entirely unrelated reasons. But by the time anybody thought to look at that photograph, the thing had been settled for years. And it was settled in his own head hardest of all. Take the stock shoot in June 1887, which is the one where nobody was hurt and nothing was lost, and which I think about the most. The gate line at the loading pens let go, and a gate dropped. It dropped onto nothing. There were no cattle under it and no men near it, and because nothing happened, nobody investigated it, nobody wrote it down. And a man named Ollis Rear spliced it in about 4 minutes and got on with his day. That is 31 minus 1. That is how a pattern stays invisible. Most of the failures in this story did not injure anybody or cost anything, and the ones that cost nothing are the ones that leave no trace at all. And they were the majority. If every one of those 31 ropes had hurt somebody, the county would have worked it out in 6 months. It was the harmless ones that kept it hidden. Because a harmless failure is not a failure. It is a Tuesday. And take the Ordway gin pole in April 1887, which I have already told you about, but not all of it. Feldkrister was 22. He had rigged that guy line himself, and he had passed it round a buried wagon wheel, because that is what was in the ground, and that is what you use. What I did not tell you is that he checked it. There is a detail in the account his family kept, and it is the detail that took me a while to be able to read without wincing. Before they raised the pole, Feldkrister went round all 4 anchors and looked at them. Because he was 22 and careful, and it was his first big rig. He saw the burr. He saw it, and he thought about it. And he decided it was small enough to be all right. And it was small enough to be all right. And he was correct. Then the rope parted at the burr, and a half-built tower came down and broke his own collarbone. And for 2 years he told everybody who asked that he had seen it and had let it go. He had done the job properly, and he had inspected his own work, and he spent 2 years believing that his one moment of judgment had been the wrong one. That is the real cost of this story, and it is not measured in dollars or in acres. 31 men, and every one of them privately certain they were the weak link in their own work, when in fact the weak link was 3 inches inside a rope where nobody on earth could see it. Now hold all of that beside a woman on a flat above a creek who knew, and who had 520 feet of proof in a shed, and who said nothing for 3 years and 2 months. I have had people tell me that she should have spoken, that she had a duty, that a person who knows a thing like that has an obligation to shout it from the courthouse steps whatever the cost to herself. And every time I go back to Arlo Beam standing in her yard in September 1886 with 40 feet of her rope broken at his feet, saying the truest sentence in this whole story. Verity, you have shown me something true. I do not have anywhere to put it. She could have spoken any day she liked. She would have been heard the way a woman with a grievance is heard. And the demonstration, the one irreplaceable thing she had, would have been spent into a room that had already made up its mind. And there would have been nothing left for September 1889, when the entire county was standing in one street asking the question out loud. Knowing a thing is not the same as being able to prove it. Being able to prove it is not the same as being believed. And being believed, as Sheriff Arlo Beam found out in a yard in 1886, is not the same as anything changing at all. He came on foot. That mattered to her. Later, a man who drives out is doing business. A man who walks 2 miles up a creek in July is doing something else. And Denton Fife knew it, and he walked. He stood at the bottom of the walk with his hat in his hand. He looked down the 900 feet of it. He had never seen it before. He had sold rope in that county for 19 years, and he had never once come up here and looked at where the other rope came from. I did not know it was this long, he said. It has to be, she said. The rope is as long as the walk. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said he had come to buy. Here is what he wanted. The county had let a contract for a bridge at the Fremont Crossing. Not a big bridge, a pile and stringer bridge, 4 bents, nothing anybody would write about. But it had to be built in the river, in August, with a pile driver on a barge. And a pile driver on a barge runs on rope. Fife had the supply contract. And Fife, who genuinely believed the Eastern rope was the same rope, had done something that tells you everything about him. He had gone and asked the pile driver. The man came up from Rawlins. He was 60, and he had driven piles for 34 years. Fife had shown him the Eastern rope, and the man had run it through his hand, and had said no. Not a speech, just no. He said he would want hand laid for the fall line, and he did not much care what it cost. Because a fall line that parts on a pile driver drops a 900-pound hammer. And he had watched that happen once in 1871 and did not care to again. So Denton Fife, who had spent 3 years selling rope that Verity Mullen said was dangerous, walked up a creek in July to buy her rope. Because a man from Rawlins had run it through his hand and said no. He did not connect the two things. I want to be fair about that. He was not being a hypocrite. In his head, these were separate matters entirely. One was the ordinary rope a county buys. The other was a special job with a fussy old man on it. He offered $1.10 the foot. She had never in her life sold rope at $1.10 the foot. Her price was 14 cents. He was offering nearly 8 times that, and he was offering it for the whole remaining coil, all 520 feet, and he was offering cash on the day. $572. I want you to understand what $572 was. It was more than she had made in the previous 2 years put together. It was the mare back, and the winter, and the roof, and the account at the feed store, and a new set of top gear for the walk. It was, in the plainest terms, the end of being poor. And she stood there and understood, inside about 3 seconds, that she could not take it. Because that coil was not rope. It had not been rope for 3 years. It was the only sample of a countable, traceable, provable long fiber rope in Sweetwater County. And the mill that spun the stock had shut in 1879. And when it was gone, she could never make another foot of anything she could stand behind absolutely. Sell it, and it goes into a river on a pile driver. It gets wet. It gets used. It gets cut up and spliced and stored badly, and in 2 years it is 3 pieces of ordinary rope in a shed, and nobody can account for any of it. And then she has nothing. Not less. Nothing, no test she could ever run again would mean a thing. Because she would have no known rope to run against. Nobody was silencing her. That is what I need you to sit with here. Denton Fife was not buying her off. The thought had not entered his head. He had walked 2 miles to offer a woman he had been unkind about 8 times the going rate for the best thing she had ever made. Because an old man from Rawlins had told him it was worth it. By his own lights he was doing something decent and slightly generous, and he was. And it would have ended her. Completely forever. That is the cruelty in this story, and there is no villain anywhere in it. The single best offer of her working life and the destruction of her only evidence were the same transaction. She could be paid properly, or she could stay able to prove it. Not both. She said she would need to think about it. Fife was surprised. He said so. He said, and this is recorded because when a cob heard him say it in the store afterwards, that he had expected her to bite his hand off. Then he said he would need an answer inside a week. Because the barge went in on the 12th of August. She thought about it for 6 days. I have some sense of what those 6 days were. Because there is one entry in her book from that summer, and it is not about rope at all. It is a column of figures. On one side is what she owed. On the other is $572. The 2 columns are not close. On the 5th of August, she walked down to the mercantile and told Denton Fife no. He did not understand. He asked her to explain, and here is the thing that makes me want to put my head in my hands. She could not explain. Because explaining meant saying the sentence she had not said in 3 years and 2 months. If she says I cannot sell you that rope because it is the only proof I have that the rope you sell is bad, then she is the woman with the grievance, standing in his store, in front of whoever is in it. And she has said it at the worst possible moment, from the weakest possible position, with nothing in her hand. So she said no. And when he pressed her, she said she had a use for it. He asked what use, and she said she had not decided yet. You can imagine how that sounded. A woman with no money and no customers turning down $572 for a coil of rope she has no plan for. Fife went away thinking she was either sentimental or simple. And he told 2 people so. And by the end of the week it was around the town, in the version that always gets around. She had turned down $572 out of spite. That is the 3rd time somebody in that county tried to help her out of the hole and had it thrown back. Let me give you the other 3. Because the pattern is the whole of her character. The first was in 1887. When a cob offered her the boarding house laundry at $11 a month, which she took, and then offered to take her on properly at $22, indoors, off the walk, permanent, she said no. When asked why, and she said then there is no rope walk. The second was in the winter of 1888. Cass Orick, who ran 6,000 acres on the bench, and who we will come to properly in a minute, sent word that he had 40 head to winter and no hand to do it, and would pay $30 the month. That is real money for a hard, dull, cold job. She said no, not because it was beneath her, because it was 90 days, and she could not lay rope for 90 days. And a walk that stands idle for 90 days in that climate needs a month of work to bring back. The 4th, and the worst, came in September of 1889, after everything else, and I will tell you that one when we get there. Because it is the one that shows exactly what she was made of. And the 3rd was the $572. Now, Cass Orick. He was 44. He was lean and weathered and quiet in the way men get when they have spent 25 years mostly outdoors and mostly alone. He had come into the country in 1871 with nothing, and by 1889 he had 6,000 acres on the bench above town and about 900 head, and he was by a distance the biggest single operator in that end of the county. He was not a romantic figure. I want to be careful with that. He was not brooding at anybody. He was a working rancher with a bad knee and an account book. And the reason he does not say much in this story is that he did not say much. He had bought rope from her twice. Once in 1885 before the Eastern rope came in, and once in the spring of 1887 when everybody else had already switched. That second purchase is worth a moment. In April 1887, he came out to the walk and bought 3 coils at 14 cents, which was $252, which was the largest single order she took in that entire decade. And when he was paying her, he said one sentence, and she thought about it for years afterwards. He said, "I do not buy rope twice. That is all." He did not explain it. He did not say the Eastern rope was bad. He was not making a point about her. He simply meant, in the flat way he meant everything, that he had worked out the arithmetic on his own place and had concluded that a rope you replace every 18 months is not cheaper than a rope you replace every 6 years, and that he was not going to be doing this again. He had not been convinced by anybody. He had just been paying attention on his own property, which almost nobody does. They were not close. They were not anything. In 4 years, they had perhaps 20 conversations, all of them about rope or weather, most of them under 2 minutes. But he was the only man in Sweetwater County who had never once had a rope part on him. And he was the only man in Sweetwater County who had never once wondered why. Because it had not occurred to him that there was anything to wonder about, which meant that when the fire came, he was the only outfit on the bench with 6 years of good rope on it, and no idea that this made him unusual. Hold that. It matters more than anything else in this story, because in the 3rd week of September 1889, at about 2:30 in the afternoon, a lightning strike on the dry end of the bench put fire into cured grass with a 30-mile wind behind it. I said she thought about it for 6 days. I want to give you those 6 days. Because they are the hardest thing in this story, and because most tellings would skip straight over them. $572 in Sweetwater County in 1889 was not a windfall. It was a different life. Let me put some real numbers against it, because a lot of money means nothing. A good hand on a ranch in that country made $30 a month and found. A school teacher made about $45. Her whole gross income in 1888 from 4 coils of rope and a boarding house laundry contract was a little over $200 for the year. And out of that came fibre, tar, tallow, and the feed for 1 horse. $572 was between 2 and 3 years of everything she earned, offered in cash, on a Tuesday, by a man who had walked 2 miles to offer it. And here is the part that makes it worse rather than better. She did not need it for anything dramatic. There was no mortgage about to foreclose and no relative dying for want of a doctor. This story does not get to have that. She needed it for the ordinary things, which is harder. She needed a roof on the shed, which had been letting water onto her tar for 2 winters. She needed to settle $41 at the feed store that she had been carrying since spring and that Ames Dorrit had never once mentioned to her, which is its own kind of debt. She needed a horse, having sold the mare in March. She needed her top gear rebuilt, which was $60 of a wheelwright's time, and which she had been putting off for a year and a half. And she needed, more than any of it, to stop lying awake doing arithmetic. That is what money is for, mostly, not for things. For the arithmetic to stop. Cobb knew about the offer within a day, because Denton Fife had told the store, and the store had told the boarding house. And when a Cobb was 62 and had run a boarding house for 30 years and knew everything before anybody. She sat Verity Mullen down in the kitchen on the second of those 6 days and told her to take it. She was not wrong to. I want to be very careful here, because it is easy to write Wenna Cobb as the friend who does not understand. And she understood perfectly. She was the one person in that county who had known the whole story since 1887. Because she was in the harness shop at the stove when Evo Marsh said, "Now, Verity, don't." Her argument was not that the rope did not matter. Her argument was this: that Verity Mullen was 33 years old and had been right for 3 years and had gained nothing at all from being right. And that being right had so far cost her a mare, a winter, a shoulder, and most of a business. And that at some point a person is allowed to take the money. She said, and this is the sentence that Verity Mullen wrote down, which is how we have it: "You cannot eat being correct." And Verity Mullen said she knew that. The third day she did nothing. There is no entry. The fourth day she went out to the shed and got the coil down and measured it, which she did not need to do because she knew exactly what was in it. And she wrote 520 in the book, and under it she wrote 13. 13 demonstrations. That is what she was actually deciding about, and it is why nobody around her could follow the argument, because from the outside she was deciding whether to sell some rope. The fifth day is the one I would most like to know about, and there is nothing. Not a line. And on the sixth day she wrote 2 columns, and I told you earlier that the columns were not close. And they were not. On the left, what she owed and needed, item by item, in her own hand: the feed store, the roof, the gear, a horse. It comes to $214 and some cents. On the right, $572. She was not choosing between poverty and comfort. She was choosing between $572 and $214, which is to say she could have paid every debt she had and had $358 left over, and been, by the standards of that flat above that creek, comfortably off for the first time in her adult life. And underneath both columns, she wrote 1 line. And it is not about money at all. It says, "After it is gone, I cannot answer the question." That is the whole decision in 8 words, and she made it on the 6th day, and walked down to the mercantile on the 5th of August, and said no. I have gone back and forth on whether she was right, not morally. Morally it is obvious and it is not interesting. She was right the way a person is right when they refuse to sell the last of something. I mean practically. Because here is the thing that keeps nagging at me. If she had taken the $572, and the pile driver had used her rope in the river, and it had held all August in front of the whole county, that is a demonstration too. A public one. On a county job, with a fussy old man from Rawlins who had refused the cheap rope in front of the man selling it. That might have worked. It might have worked better, and she would have been out of debt. The reason it would not have worked, I think, and the reason she was right, is the same reason the whole story exists: rope that does not fail proves nothing. A pile driver runs all August on good rope and nothing happens. Nothing happening is not evidence. Nobody watches a rope that holds. Nobody has ever watched a rope that holds. The only thing that has ever convinced anybody about a rope is watching one break beside another one, on the same day, off the same scale, and knowing where both of them came from. She needed a failure to point at, and it had to be theirs. And it had to be in public. And she had to be holding the thing that did not fail. She could not buy that with $572. She could only wait for it. So she waited 7 more weeks. And on the 19th of September, a lightning strike gave it to her. You have to understand what a range fire is, because it is not what people picture. It is not a wall of flame. Not usually. Not in cured grass on a bench in September. It is a line. A line of fire may be 2 feet high, moving at the speed of a trotting horse. That goes round things and through things, and does not stop for a fence or a road or a creek if the creek is low. Behind it is black ground and heat. In front of it is grass. You cannot put it out. Nobody puts out a range fire. That is not what men do when they turn out for one. What you do is take the fuel away in a line, and hold that line, and let the fire come to it and die. There are 2 ways to do that in 1889, and both of them run on rope. The first is a fire drag. You take a green cowhide, or several, and you wet them, and you tie them to a chain. And you tie the chain to 2 saddle horses, one either side, and you drag the whole thing along the burning edge. The hide smothers the low flame. The 2 riders keep the chain tight. That works, and it is fast, and it is how most of it was done. The second is a plow line. You put a team on a breaking plow, and you turn a strip of bare earth. And if the fire is coming fast, you put 2 or 3 teams on it, and you run them until they cannot run. Both of those things are the same object under load, a rope with a horse on one end and something heavy on the other, running hot and dry and dusty for hours. The strike came in on the dry end at about 2:30 on the 19th of September. By 4 o'clock there was a front of about 6 miles. By dark there was a front of about 22. By the middle of the night, there were something over 200 men out on that bench from every outfit in the county. And the front was somewhere between 30 and 40 miles, depending on who you asked and where they had been standing. 40 miles. It is hard to hold in the head. It is a line of fire, longer than the county road. I am going to tell you what happened to the rope that night, and I want to be plain about something first. Nobody died in that fire. I have checked as carefully as it can be checked. There were injuries, and some of them were bad, and there was a very great deal of stock moved in a hurry. But the men came off the bench. What broke that night was equipment. The first drag line went at about 6 in the evening on the Rennick place. 2 riders, a wet hide, a rope to the chain. It parted about a foot from the eye, and the chain came round and took a horse's legs from under it, and the horse got up, and the rider did not for about a minute. They tied a knot in it and went on. That is what you do. You have a fire in front of you. The second went 20 minutes later on the same drag. By 9 o'clock men on that bench had stopped being surprised. I have a count of 9 separate parted lines that night. It is from a compensation claim the county put in afterwards, and it is probably low. Because a man who ties a knot and keeps going does not file anything. 9 in one night, in one county, on one job. And here is the moment. This is where 3 years of silence and 31 unconnected accidents came together. And it did not happen because anybody made a speech. It happened because for the first time in 3 years, every outfit in Sweetwater County was doing the exact same job, at the exact same time, in the exact same conditions, in sight of each other. That had never happened before. A gin pole goes over at the Ordway place in April, and a picket line goes at the school section in September, and there is no way on earth to see those as the same event. Because they are 5 months and 40 miles apart, and they are different work. But 9 lines parting in one night, on one bench, with men who can see each other's lanterns, is not 9 accidents. It is a pattern, and it is visible. And it is visible to everybody at once. Somewhere around midnight, a man on the Halloran drag said the thing out loud that made it real. He had just tied his second knot. He straightened up, and he said, "Whose rope is this? Not what did I do wrong? Whose rope is this?" That is the entire 3 years, in 4 words, from a man who had never spoken to Verity Milan in his life. And the answer went round that bench in about 2 hours, because men on a fire line talk, and because the answer was the same everywhere. It came out of fifes. All of it came out of fifes. Every outfit on that bench had bought the Eastern rope, because every outfit on that bench bought it the cheapest number on the list. Every outfit except one. Cass Oric had 11 men and 4 drags working the north end all night, and he did not part a single line. Not one, not at any point, from 3:30 in the afternoon on the 19th to about 8 in the morning on the 20th, with the same hides and the same chains and the same horses and the same heat as everybody else. He did not notice. That is the part I love. He genuinely did not notice, because from where he stood, nothing unusual was happening. Rope held. Rope had always held. He had bought rope twice in his life, and both times he had bought it from the woman on the flat above the creek. And he had never thought about it again. It was other men who noticed. By about 4 in the morning, riders coming down off the north end with a working drag were being asked what they were running. And they were saying, more or less, we do not know. It is the boss's rope. It came off the place. And by first light on the 20th of September, standing in ash, at the point where the line had held, there were something like 40 men who had all arrived at the same question by 40 separate routes. The fire died on the break at about 9 in the morning, on the 20th when the wind came round. They lost, in the end, somewhere between 9,000 and 11,000 acres of grass, 3 barns, 2 sets of corrals, and a quantity of fence that nobody ever counted properly. In that country and that year, that is a hard blow, and it is not a catastrophe. It could have been very much worse, and everybody standing in that ash knew it. Verity Milan was not on the bench. I should say that plainly. She was 33 years old, and she was in town. And she spent that night doing what the women in town did, which was feeding 200 men in relays out of the boarding house and 3 kitchens, and taking in 2 families who had come off the dry end with what they could carry. She heard about the rope at about 5 in the morning from a rider who came in for coffee and said, without any idea at all who he was talking to, that the lines had been going all night and that somebody had said it was the store rope. Wenna Cobb, who was 62 and who had known exactly what was going on for 3 years because she is the one who had listened at the stove in 1887, put a hand on the counter and said, "There it is." And Verity Mullins said nothing at all and went on cutting bread, because she had 520 feet of rope in a shed and 13 demonstrations left. And for the first time since June 1886, there was a room worth spending one on. She had 3 days. That is not a figure of speech. Here is why it was 3 days. A fire like that produces a meeting. It has to. There is compensation to sort out, and fence to reckon, and a county to bill. And in Sweetwater County, that meant the commissioners sat, and they sat on the Monday, which was the 23rd. Everybody would be there, every outfit that had been on that bench. Fife, beam, all of them, in one room on one day, angry, and asking a question they had never asked before. After that, it disperses. Men go home. The grass comes back. The story turns into there was a lot of trouble with rope that night, and inside a year it is nothing at all. 3 days. And on the Saturday, the 21st, with 2 days to go, she got the 4th offer. It came from Denton Fife, and it came by way of his brother-in-law. And it was this. He would take her entire output at 16 cents the foot, guaranteed, everything she could lay, for 3 years. Sold in his store, under his own name. Read that again. It is the best commercial offer anybody made to Verity Milan in her life. 16 cents is above her own price. Guaranteed offtake for 3 years. It is security. It is her walk running full. It is the end of every problem she had. Under his own name. not hers. His rope sold as store rope. No maker's mark, no account of where it came from, and, obviously and unavoidably, no argument on the Monday about whose rope had been parting on the bench. Because the woman making the argument would be under contract to the man she would be arguing with, starting the same week. Was that deliberate? I have gone round and round on it, and I have to tell you honestly that I do not know, and that I lean towards no. I think Denton Fife had spent Friday listening to men come off that bench, and had understood in a real and frightening way that he had sold the whole county a bad rope for 3 years without knowing it. And I think his response was the response of a decent trader in a panic. Get the good rope, get all of it, get it now, and put it on my shelf. I do not think he was buying her silence. I think her silence was simply included, free, in a way that would not have occurred to him, and that he would have been offended to have pointed out. She said no. Winnicott told her she was a fool. Winnicott was, I think, entitled to. And Verity Moulin said the only thing she said out loud about any of it in that whole 3 years. And she said it to a 62-year-old woman in a kitchen at 6 a.m. And it is the closest thing to a statement of principle that survives from her. She said, if it goes on his shelf, then in 5 years there is no rope in this county that anybody can point at. That is it. That is the whole of it. She was not protecting her pride or her price. She was protecting the existence of a known thing in a county that had just found out, at the cost of 11,000 acres and Royce Tolliver's wrist, what it costs when nothing is known. I want to slow the night of the 19th right down, because everything this story has been building for 3 years happens inside about 10 hours. And it happens to men who have no idea they are in a story at all. At 2:30, the strike came in on the dry end. The dry end of that bench had not had rain since the 2nd week of July. The grass was cured standing, which means it was hay that had never been cut, 18 inches of it. And there was a wind out of the southwest that had been getting up all afternoon. The first man to see it was a hand of the Rennick outfit named Silas Poe, who was riding a fence line about 3 miles off, and who did the correct thing, which was to look at it for about 4 seconds and then ride flat out for the nearest house instead of trying to do anything about it himself. By 4 o'clock there was a front of about 6 miles and 40 men on it. By 6 there were nearer 90, because word had gone down the valley, and every outfit sends everybody, always, without being asked, because next time it is your grass. And here is what those men were actually doing, hour after hour in the dark, and I want you to have it clearly. Because the rope is not incidental to it. The rope is the work. 2 riders. Between them, a chain. On the chain, 2 green hides soaked in a creek. Each rider has a rope from his saddle horn to the chain. They ride the burning edge at a trot, with the hides dragging across it, one rider on the black side, one on the grass side, and the hides smother the low flame as they go. Then they turn and come back and do it again. The horses hate it. Every instinct a horse has says go the other way. And the rider's whole job for hours on end is to keep an animal doing the one thing it most wants not to do. 3 feet from a fire, in the dark, in smoke, at a trot. The rope is what connects the animal to the load. It is running hot, it is running dusty, it is taking a jerk every few seconds as the hides catch and release on rough ground. And the rider cannot see it because he is watching the fire. When it parts, the chain whips. It whips towards whichever rider still has a line on, because he is now taking the whole drag on his own. That is the job. That is what 200 men did on that bench from the afternoon of the 19th to 8 in the morning on the 20th. The first line went at about 6 in the evening on the Rennick drag and took a horse's legs out and put a rider on the ground for a minute. They tied a knot in it. I keep coming back to that. They tied a knot in it and carried on. Because there is a fire in front of you, and you do not stop a fire to have a think about your equipment. A knot in a rope, incidentally, costs you about half its strength. Every man out there knew that. They tied them anyway, because half a rope now is worth more than a whole rope in the morning. The second went on the same drag 20 minutes later, at the knot, which is exactly where it would go. By 9 o'clock there were 4 down that anybody could count. By midnight there were 7. And the thing that was happening in those men's heads across those hours is the thing this whole story turns on, so let me put it as plainly as I can. Each one of them, when his line went, reached for his own mistake. Bad angle. Too tight. Ran it over the tongue. Should have wet it. Should not have wet it. Shock-loaded it coming out of the swale. Every one of those is a real cause. Every one of those happens. And a man standing in the dark with a burnt rope in his hand and a fire 40 feet away will always, always find one. That is not stupidity. That is competence. A good workman's first instinct when his gear fails is to ask what he did. And it is the correct instinct. And for 3 years in Sweetwater County, it was the exact thing keeping everybody blind. What broke it was not that the failures were worse that night. It was that they were simultaneous and visible and shared. Because on a fire line at midnight, you can see other outfits' lanterns. You ride past men you know. You come back to the water wagon at the same time. And what men do at a water wagon at midnight is complain about their night. And by about 11 o'clock, men at that water wagon were finding out that their private embarrassing failure was not private. Halloran said it at about midnight, and I have already told you what he said. Whose rope is this? But I did not tell you what happened in the 20 seconds after, and it is better than the line itself. Nobody answered him, because none of them knew. Not one man out of the 5 or 6 standing there could tell you where the rope on his own saddle had come from, or when it was bought, or what it was made of, or by whom. They knew the brand of every horse on that bench. They knew who had bred what, and out of which mare, and in what year. Those men could recite the entire pedigree of an animal they had seen twice, and not one of them could tell you a single fact about the object holding 700 pounds of burning hide to their saddle horn. That is not a criticism of them. It is a fact about rope. Rope is the most invisible object on a working place. It is everywhere, it is cheap, it does everything. And nobody thinks about it once, until 9 of them part in one night in front of everybody. Somebody at that water wagon eventually said it came from Fifes, because it all came from Fifes. And that was the end of the mystery and the beginning of the trouble. And then, at about 4 in the morning, the north end came into it. Cass Oryx's outfit had been working the north break since about 5 the previous afternoon. 11 men and 4 drags. He had put them there because that is where his grass was, and because that was the line that mattered to him. And he had been there all night, doing exactly what everybody else was doing. Riders started coming down off the north end for water at about 4. And men at the wagon, who by that point had a running tally going and a good deal of feeling about it, asked them how many they had lost. And a Oryx rider said none. He said it the way you say a thing that is not interesting. He was not making a point. He genuinely did not understand why he was being asked. Because from where he had been standing all night, nothing at all had happened. Rope had held. Rope holds. That is what it does. They asked him again. He said none again. I would give a great deal to have been at that water wagon. Because there were by then 6 or 8 men standing there in the dark, with burnt hands and 7 knots between them, being told by a man from the north end that his outfit had run 4 drags for 11 hours without a single parting. And somebody asked the question that a county learns to ask once and then never stops asking. He asked, "Whose rope has he got?" She did not sleep on the Sunday night. I know that because Effie Lunn was not yet working for her. And when a cob was, and when a cob saw the lamp, the boarding house sat where it could see the flat above the creek. Not close, perhaps half a mile. Far enough that a lamp is a point of light and nothing else. It was lit at 11. It was lit at 2. It was lit at 4. Here is what she was doing. She was rigging the cart. Not loading it. Rigging it. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole morning. She had 2 walk posts to take. Each one is 5 feet of oak, and it weighs what oak weighs. She had a set of blocks. She had 200 feet of light line to reeve them. And she had the balance. The balance was the problem, and she had known it was the problem for 3 years. It was not hers. It belonged to the freight company. It lived on a bracket in the depot, and it weighed sacks of grain and boxes of nails. And it was the only instrument within 60 miles that anybody in Sweetwater County trusted. She could not simply take it. She had asked. She had gone to Royce Tolliver on the Saturday, 2 days after the fire went out, with a wrist he could not turn, and 200 men still coming down off the bench. And she had asked to borrow the freight scale on the Monday morning. He said yes before she finished the sentence. Then, he said something better. He said he would have 2 men check it on the Sunday and sign that they had checked it, and he would have them be men who had no rope in the argument. He had waited 3 years and 2 months to be useful about this. He had 40 minutes on a holiday afternoon in 1886 and a wrist that would not turn. And this was the first thing anybody had let him do with it. So she rigged the cart. She cut the light line to length. She reeved the blocks and unreeved them and reeved them again. She checked the eye splices on the 40 feet, both of them, twice by lamp. She was not nervous about the result. I want to be clear about that. She had done this demonstration twice, and she knew exactly what the numbers would be, near enough. She was nervous about the rig. Because a thing that everybody forgets about a public demonstration is that it can fail for reasons that have nothing to do with what you are demonstrating. A block can jam. A post can move. A splice can draw. And when any one of those happens in front of 200 people, nobody says the rig failed. They say she failed. And she does not get to try again, because the next demonstration costs 40 more feet and there is no second Monday. She had one attempt, in front of everybody, on borrowed equipment, in a street. That is why the lamp was lit at 4. At about 6, she stopped and made coffee and sat on the step. There is a detail here that I have not been able to stop thinking about. It comes from Wenna Cobb, who walked up at about 6:30 with bread because she had seen the lamp all night. She found Verity Milan sitting on the step with the cart rigged and the canvas over it and a cup in both hands. And she asked her whether she was ready, and Verity Milan said she had been ready since 1886. Then she said the other thing, the one Wenna Cobb repeated for the next 30 years, and which is the closest this story gets to bitterness. She said it was never the rope. She meant it plainly. The rope had been ready since 1886. The rope had never needed 3 years. The rope had never needed a fire, or 31 accidents, or a man's wrist, or 11,000 acres of grass. The only thing that had needed 3 years was the county. At 8, she woke the boy she had hired to mind the cart. His name was Deems Ivy, and he was 16, and he had been paid 2 bits and told to sit with it and say nothing to anybody. And he did both. And he was still telling people about it when he was 80. At 8:30, she walked the cart down. She did not take it to the courthouse. She left it at the corner, under canvas, out of the way, where nobody going into that meeting would walk past it. That was deliberate, too. She had thought about walking in with it, setting it up at the front, being ready. And she had decided against it, for the same reason she had left a rope on a nail behind a harness shop in June. A woman who arrives at a public meeting with a demonstration already rigged is a woman who came to make a point. Whatever happens after that is something she brought with her. A woman who is standing in the street and who is asked and who then says there is a cart at the corner is something else entirely. So she left it at the corner with a 16-year-old boy on it, and she went and stood in the crowd. And she waited about an hour and a half through fence claims and stock counts and an argument about a section line. And then a man named Holleran stood up and asked about the rope. The commissioners sat at 10 on the Monday. They sat in the courthouse. It was a plain brick building with 9 steps up to the door and a room upstairs that held about 60 people if they stood. About 200 came. So they moved it. They put a table at the top of the steps, and the commissioners sat behind it, and everybody else stood in the street. And that is why what happened next happened outdoors, in front of everyone, instead of upstairs in front of 60. That was luck. She did not plan it. I want to be honest about that. She had planned to stand up in her room. The morning went the way those mornings go. Fence claims. Stock counts. A long argument about a section line, men shifting their weight. And then, about an hour in, a man named Halloran stood up and asked about the rope. It was the same man. The one who had said whose rope is this at midnight on the bench with a knot in his hand. He was not a leader, and he was not angry. He just wanted to know. He said his outfit had parted 3 lines in one night. He said he had never parted a line in 11 years before that. He wanted to know what was in the rope. Denton Fife stood up to answer, because he had to. He was the man who sold it. And here is where I have to be fair to him one last time, because what he said was true, and it was the best he had. He said the rope was Manila. He said it came from a mill in the east that supplied 40 counties. He said it was sold to him as good rope, and he had no reason on earth to think it was not. He said he had rope in his own store that had been on the shelf 2 years and looked perfect. And he invited anybody to come and look at it. And that was the trap, and he walked into it without anybody setting it. Because he was right, it did look perfect. It looked perfect because it was perfect, on a shelf, dry, indoors. That was the whole thing. There was a silence, and Halloran said, "Well then, what happened?" And Verity Mullins said, "From the street, it got wet." I would like to tell you the crowd turned. It did not. Most of them did not know who she was. A few did. Somebody laughed, not unkindly, the way people do when a big woman in a plain dress says something odd in the middle of a public meeting. Arlo Beam, from the table, said her name. He said, "Verity." He had been carrying a thing he had nowhere to put for 3 years. And here was somewhere to put it. He said, "Come up here." She had a cart. It had been standing at the corner since 8:30 that morning, with a canvas over it, and there was a boy of about 16 minding it, who had been paid 2 bits and told to say nothing. Under the canvas were 2 walk posts, a set of blocks, a spring balance off the freight scale, and 40 feet of rope. 40 feet, the last 40 feet she would ever spend in front of a crowd. And the crowd was 200 people and every outfit in the county. And this was the room. After 3 years and 2 months of not saying it, this was the room. She had 480 feet left after that day. And it did not matter anymore, and I will come to why. It took 20 minutes to rig. That is a long time in front of 200 people and nobody left. She did it exactly the way she had done it in her own yard for Royce Tolliver on the 4th of July, 1886. 2 posts, blocks between them, the balance in the line, 2 samples, both 5/8, both spliced the same way, both eyed the same way. She asked Denton Fife for a piece of his rope. That is the detail that made it work, and she knew it would. She did not bring the Eastern rope with her. She could have. She had plenty. She asked him, in front of 200 people, to go and get a piece off his own shelf. Because the whole thing turns on the sample being his. Nothing she carried in a cart could survive the sentence, "How do we know where that came from?" His could. He went. It took him 6 minutes, and nobody said much while he was gone. He came back with about 25 feet off a coil that had been in the store since spring. And he handed it to her on the courthouse steps, and I think somewhere in those 6 minutes he had understood what was about to happen. Because a man does not walk that slowly for no reason. She cut it in half in front of them. One half she spliced into the rig. The other half she gave to Arlo Beam and asked him to hold it. Then she did the thing that made it undeniable. She took a bucket of water, and she put the sample in it. Not for a day. There was no day. There were 200 people standing in a street. She soaked it for about 4 minutes and wrung it out and passed it along the front row and asked them to feel it. And then she rigged it wet. And she said, clearly, so the back could hear, "This is not the test. This is faster than the test. A rope on a ranch gets wet and dries out and gets wet again 40 times a year. I am doing it once. Wet. Right now. In front of you. It will do better today than it will do on your place." Then she pulled it. It went at 1,050 pounds. There is a particular noise a rope makes when it parts under a real load, and it is not like anything else. It is a crack and a whip together. And the whole rig jumps, and 200 people who have never heard it before all take a half step back at once. She read the number off the balance and said it out loud and asked Beam to come and read it too. And he did, and he said it again. 1,050. Then she rigged hers. Hers had not been in a bucket. She said so. She said it plainly, and she made a point of it, which is a strange thing to do when you are trying to win an argument, and it is the reason the argument was won. She said, "This one is dry. That is not fair to his. I will do it again wet if you want it. I have the rope." Nobody wanted it done again. But she offered, in front of them, before the result. And every man there heard her offer. She pulled hers. It went at 3,190. 3 times. In the street. In front of everybody. Off a balance that belonged to the freight company and had been checked that morning by 2 men who had no interest in the outcome. And then, before anybody could speak, she did the last thing. And this is the part that I think was the whole of her. She held up the broken end of the eastern rope, and she pulled the core out of it with her fingers. Short-fibre. Fluff. Near enough. It came out in her hand in pieces 3 and 4 inches long, out of a rope that was supposed to be made of fibers running its whole length, and she held her hand up with it and turned round so the street could see, and she said, "That is what you have all been hanging things on. It is not his fault. He did not make it." But that is what it is. Nobody cheered. I have read 2 separate accounts of that morning, and neither of them mentions a cheer. And I believe that. Because it was not that kind of moment. What happened was that about 200 men went very quiet and then began all at once to talk to each other, and what they were talking about was not rope. They were talking about April 1887 at the Ordway place, and the school section well, and the picket line, and 31 other things spread over 26 months, each of which had been one man's private conviction that he had been careless. I said earlier that the cost of this was not money. Here is the actual cost, and it came due in the street in Sweetwater County on the 23rd of September 1889. Feld Christer, who was 24 by then, had spent 2 years apologizing for a burr on a wagon rim. And Royce Tolliver, standing at the back with a wrist that would not turn, had spent 3 months telling people he had run a line at a bad angle. That is what she gave them back. Not compensation, not a verdict. She gave 31 men their own competence back, in one morning, for 40 feet of rope. Denton Fife did not go home and sulk. I have to give him this, and I give it to him gladly. Because it is rare. He stood on those steps and watched a woman he had been unkind about pull his own rope apart in front of the whole county. And then he walked back to his store. And he took every coil of the eastern rope off the wall, all of it, about 1,900 feet, and he stacked it in the back. He did it that afternoon. Nobody made him. There was no order, no vote, no law. The commissioners had not so much as passed a resolution. He just took it down. Then he sat down and wrote to the mill. That letter survives, because the reply survives, and the reply is the most interesting document in this entire story. I want to give it to you properly. He asked them a plain question. He asked what their rope was made of, and why it had failed. And they answered him, promptly and politely, and they did not lie. Not one word of it was a lie. They wrote that the rope was, as advertised, hard-laid manila cordage. They wrote that it was manufactured to their standard specification for general agricultural and general purpose use. They wrote that it was not represented as marine cordage, nor as long fibre stock, nor as suitable for sustained wet service, and that customers requiring those qualities were directed to their premium line, which was listed in the same catalog at rather more than double the price. Then they wrote the sentence that I keep thinking about. They wrote that they would be happy to supply the premium line to Sweetwater County at any time, and that they had not previously received an order for it. Nobody had ever ordered the good rope. It was there. It was in the catalog. It had been in the catalog the whole time, on the same page, 4 lines down. And for 3 years, every buyer in that county had run a finger along the list, found the cheapest number, and stopped reading. There was no fraud. There was never any fraud. There was a catalog with 2 ropes in it, and a county that only ever read 1 line. Fife pinned that letter up in his store. To his great credit, he pinned up the whole thing, including the part that made him look worst, which was the last sentence. And that, more than the demonstration, is what changed the buying. Men could argue with a woman in a street. Nobody could argue with a printed catalog page that had been sitting on the counter the whole time. Now let me deal with what did not happen. Because it is important, and because it is not what you would expect. There was no lawsuit. Not one. There was talk of it for about 2 weeks. Somebody said the word actionable in the boarding house, and it went round. And then it died. And it died for the reason Arlo Beam had explained to Verity Milan in her own yard 3 years earlier. There was nothing to sue about. Every party had done exactly what they said they would do. Denton Fife was not ruined. He lost about $130 on the rope he took off the wall and never sold. And he lost some standing for about a year. And then he did not lose it anymore. Because he had taken the rope down himself on the same afternoon, and everybody had watched him do it. He was, at the time of his death in 1907, still running that store. Feldkrister found out on the 23rd of September 1889 that he had not put a tank tower on the ground when he was 22. He was 24 by then. He had been carrying it for 2 years. There is a note in a family record that says he did not speak much that evening and that he went out to the barn for a long while, and I would not want to guess at anything beyond that. Royce Tolliver's wrist did not get better. That is not the sort of story this is. What he got was different. He got to stop saying it was his fault. And he got to hear 200 men in a street work out at the same moment that it had not been. He ran that freight outfit for another 31 years, and from the last week of September 1889, he bought every foot of rope that outfit used from the flat above the creek, and paid list, and never once asked for a discount. And the buying changed. Everywhere. all at once. That is the part everybody expects, and it is the part I have to complicate. Because it is where the real trouble started. Between the 24th of September and the middle of November 1889, Verity Mullen took orders for a little over 14,000 feet of rope. 14,000 feet. I want to put that against what she could do. A 600-foot coil took her 9 days. Call it 23 coils to fill those orders. Call it 207 working days on a walk that in that country is workable maybe 210 days in a year, if the weather is kind and if she never stops for anything. She had won, completely, and the prize was 14,000 feet of orders, and one woman and one walk. And that is not even the real problem. The real problem is worse, and it is the thing this whole story has been walking towards. She could not make the rope she had just proved. The 480 feet in her shed came from the last bale of the Penhale stock out of a mill that shut in 1879. She had bought what was left in one lot in 1882 and hoarded it for 7 years. And it was gone. Not low. Gone. Every foot of the 14,000 she was now being asked for would have to be laid out of whatever stock she could buy in 1890, from mills she had never dealt with, at grades she would have to learn. She could still make good rope, much better than the Eastern rope, by a distance, because she was laying it soft and four-strand and slow. And that is most of the battle. But she could not make provable rope anymore. Not the way she meant it. Not rope she could stand behind yarn by yarn from bale to coil with a book in her hand, and a mill she trusted behind her. The thing she had spent 3 years and 2 months protecting the ability to prove, she was now unable to make. I find that almost unbearably neat, and I have checked it 3 ways, because I did not want it to be true. And it is. When a cob asked her about it in the first week of October, sitting in the boarding house kitchen, she asked whether she was going to tell anybody. And she said no again. Not out of vanity, out of the same arithmetic she had been running since 1886, only now it ran the other way. The county had just learned, at the cost of 11,000 acres, to ask a question it had never asked before. Whose rope is this? What is in it? Where did the stock come from? Can you tell me? If she stood up in October and said, by the way, I can no longer answer those questions perfectly either, the county would not learn anything useful from it. It would simply stop asking, and in 5 years there would be no rope anybody could point at. Which is precisely the thing she had refused $572 and a 3-year contract to prevent. So she said nothing again for the second time, for exactly the opposite reason. And instead, she did something I did not expect at all when I started looking into this, and which took me a while to understand. She wrote it all down and gave it away. Every bit of it. The method, the 9 days, the soft lay, the 4 strands, what to look for in a bale, how to run a yarn through a closed hand and hear the difference, the break test, the tackle, the balance, the way to rig it so nobody can say your scale is crooked. She wrote it out over that winter in a hand that gets tired towards the end of the long pages. And in March 1890, she gave a copy to 2 men in Rawlins and 1 in Green River who made rope, and who were, in the plainest commercial sense, her competitors. She had spent 3 years unable to convince anybody. And the moment she finally could, what she did with it was make sure the knowledge did not depend on her being alive. Elias Penhale, the bad-tempered little Cornishman who took a 14-year-old girl because nobody else would work for what he paid, had done exactly the same thing for exactly the same reason, and had never once said so. And she had not understood it until she was 33 years old, and standing in a shed looking at 480 feet of rope she could not replace. Cass Orick did not come to see her after the fire. I think people expect that he did. He did not. He went home and counted stock and mended fence. Because that is what a man with 6,000 acres does the week after a fire. and he did it through October and most of November. What he did do was send her an order. It came by his foreman, on paper, in a hand that was not his, for 2,400 feet. 2,400 feet is 4 coils. It was again the largest single order she had. And it came in the middle of a rush when she could have sold every foot she made to anybody. He did not ask for a price, and he did not ask for a date. The paper said at the bottom, in the same clerk's hand, "When it suits, when it suits." She was 6 months behind, and every other order in the book had a date on it, and a man behind the date. She laid his 4 coils last. That is worth knowing. She put the man who asked for nothing at the back of the queue, and he never once asked about it, and neither of them mentioned it for a year. Now, the winter of 1889 into 1890 was the hardest she had, and it was hard for a reason that would have been funny if it had been happening to somebody else. She could not keep up. 14,000 feet of orders, 9 days a coil. She was 33, and she had been doing 40 miles of walking a day since she was 14. And that winter her right shoulder began to go. And there is a run of entries in her book in January where the daily footage drops and then drops again. She hired. That is the practical answer, and she took it. And it did not work the first time. She took on 2 men in December and let them both go in 6 weeks. And the note in the book about it is one line: they will not walk it out. They wanted to lay it faster. Of course they did. Every instinct in a working man says that if the rope is good at 9 days, it will be nearly as good at 6. And it is not, and you cannot see the difference. And that is the entire problem with rope, and always has been. The third hire worked, and worked for 20 years. And her name was Effie Lunn. She was 19. She was the second daughter of a family burned off the dry end in September. And she had precisely no reason in the world to be careful about anything. Verity Milan taught her the way Ilias Penhale had taught, which is to say she made her run yarn through a closed hand for 3 weeks before she was allowed to touch the top gear. And Effie Lunn, who by every account had a mouth on her, put up with it. By March there were 2 of them walking it. And the footage came back, and the shoulders settled down to a thing she lived with rather than a thing that stopped her. And in the April of 1890, the boiler came. There was a new mill going up on the South Fork, a proper one, steam, and the boiler for it came in on the railroad at the depot, and had to go 9 miles out and up. The Sweetwater grade is not a mountain. I do not want to make it into one. It is a long pull out of the river bottom onto the bench, about 1.5 miles of it, and at the steep end it is bad enough that freight outfits had been double-teaming it for 20 years without thinking about it. The boiler weighed a little over 7 tons on the wagon. Royce Tolliver had the contract. Of course he did. And Royce Tolliver, with a wrist that would not turn, was not going to make one single decision about that haul on price. They put 14 head of oxen on it. Not horses, oxen, borrowed and hired from 4 different places. Because for a dead slow heavy pull-up a grade you want oxen, and everybody knew it, and because 14 head is what the arithmetic said, and Tolliver was not shaving the arithmetic. And 14 head of oxen in a string need a chain and a rope. And the rope is the part that matters. Because you cannot run a hitch that long on chain alone. Chain is heavy, and chain has no give. A hitch with no give in it will jerk itself apart on a rough grade, and take a beast's shoulder with it. You want a length of rope in that hitch. It is the shock absorber. It is what turns 14 separate animals into one pull. And it has to hold. Because when a hitch parts on a grade with 7 tons behind it, the wagon runs back. Tolliver came to the walk in the last week of March and asked for 200 feet of the heaviest she could lay. She laid it in 11 days, out of the best stock she could buy in 1890, which was not the Penhale stock and never would be again. And it was, she said afterwards, probably the best rope she made that year. Probably, that was the word she used. And she used it because she was honest, and because with the new stock, she could no longer say more than probably. And she hated that, and there was nothing on God's earth she could do about it. They took the boiler up on the 14th of April. Half the town came out for it. That sounds like an exaggeration, and it is not. A 7-ton boiler on 14 oxen up the Sweetwater grade was the largest single piece of work anybody in that county had seen. And it was a Monday, and people came. Verity Mullen did not come. Effie Lunn went, and came back and told her about it. And there is a note in the book for the 14th of April 1890 that says only 200F to RT, held, that is the entire entry. The rope held. The boiler went up. It took most of a day, and it was, by all accounts, extremely boring to watch, which is exactly what everybody wanted. And at the top of the grade, with the wagon standing and 14 head blowing and about 200 people spread out along the bank, Cass Orick did the thing that this county talked about for 30 years. He walked up to the hitch. He took hold of the rope, about the middle of it, where it came back off the lead chain. And he stood there holding it, in front of everybody, for a good while, the way a man does when he is deciding whether to say something. Then he asked Royce Tolliver, loudly enough for the bank to hear, where the rope had come from. Tolliver told him. Of course he did. Everybody there already knew. And Cass Orick said, then I will have 4,000 feet of it, and I will have it before anybody else's, and I will pay what she asks and not a cent under. That is not a proposal. I want to be clear. He did not propose to her on a grade in front of 200 people. Because he was 44 years old and not an idiot. But everybody standing on that bank understood exactly what had been said. Because of the last 6 words. I will pay what she asks and not a cent under. For 4 years that county had haggled her down, gone elsewhere for 7 cents, laughed at 14, and told her that everything that woman makes is too heavy. And the biggest operator in the end of the county stood on a public road with her rope in his hand and said in front of everybody that her price was her price. He was not defending her. That is what makes it work. He was making a purchase, out loud on commercial terms at her number, and letting 200 people watch him do it. She heard about it that evening from Effie Lunn, who ran the last half-mile. There is no record of what she said. Effie Lunn told the story for the next 40 years, and she always stopped at the same place. And what she always said was that Verity Mullen put down the yarn she was working and went and stood at the far end of the walk for about 10 minutes with her back to the shed, 900 feet away, where nobody could see her face. Then she came back and finished the day's laying. Because there were 11,000 feet still on the book, and the light was going. There is one more thing about the 480 feet, and I want to put it here. Because it is small and because it is the best thing she ever did with it, she used it 4 more times. Not as proof. The proving was over. She used it to teach. The first was Effie Lunn, in the March of 1890, at the end of the 3 weeks of yarn through a closed fist. She took her out to the shed and got the coil down and cut 20 feet off it. Effie Lunn, who was 19 and who had been told what that coil was, said she should not, and Verity Mullen said, you cannot learn ordinary off a book. Then she rigged it, and broke it, and made the girl put her hand on the parted end, and feel where it had gone and how, and made her do it again, with a piece of the eastern rope Fife had never managed to sell, and made her say out loud what was different. That is how Elias Penhale had done it in Paducah in 1870. That is how it goes down. The second and third were the 2 men from Rawlins in the spring of 1891 who had her written method in their hands and who could not make the last part of it work. She went down on the train. She spent 3 days. She spent 40 feet. They got it. both of them. There was rope coming out of Rawlins by 1893 that a man could ask questions about and get answers, and there's a straight line from that to a woman cutting up her own irreplaceable coil in somebody else's yard. The fourth was in 1904, and she was 48. And it was for a county inspector. That is worth 20 seconds on its own. By 1904, Wyoming had begun, slowly and in the unglamorous way these things happen, to write specifications into public contracts. Somebody in Cheyenne had decided that rope bought with public money should have to hold a stated figure. And a man came out from the state to work out how you would actually test such a thing on a county road with no laboratory. She showed him 2 posts, blocks, a balance, 2 samples, 1 known. The same rig she had built in her own yard for Royce Tolliver on the 4th of July, 1886, when nobody believed her, and it changed nothing at all. He wrote it down. I have not been able to establish whether that method went into the state's procedure or whether he simply took it away in a notebook and it died there. The records for that office are incomplete, and I am not going to claim more than I can show. But she was 48. And a man from the government came out to a flat above a creek in Sweetwater County and asked a rope maker how you prove a rope. And she cut 40 feet off the last coil she had and showed him. That is 3 demonstrations for proving and 4 for teaching. She was better at the second than the first, and it took her until she was 34 to find that out. 480 feet went into the shed in 1889. 380 feet came out of it in a glass case in 1921. And the 100 feet in between went into other people's hands, on purpose, 1 40-foot length at a time, until there was nobody left in that part of Wyoming who needed her to be the one holding the proof. They were married in the October of 1890 at the ranch by a preacher who came up from Rawlins. There were 60-odd people. Cobb did the food. Effie Lund stood up with her. Royce Tolliver came and could not shake hands properly and did it anyway with the wrong one, and made a joke about it that was not very good, and everybody laughed too much because they were glad to. Denton Fife was there. He came, and he brought a gift, and the gift was a brass spring balance, a good one, better than the freight scale, in a fitted wooden case. I have thought about that gift a great deal. It is either the most graceful apology anybody made in this entire story, or it is a man who never once understood what he had been part of, giving a rope maker a scale because rope makers use scales. I choose to believe it was the first. There is no evidence either way. He was, by every account, a decent man who had been wrong for 3 years in a way that hurt people, and who took his own stock off the wall in an afternoon without being told to, and I am willing to let him have the benefit of it. She kept working. That is the part people never expect. She did not sell the walk and move up to the bench and become a rancher's wife with 6,000 acres. She was 34 years old, and she had a business with 11,000 feet on the book. And Cass Orick, whatever else he was a man who had said out loud in front of 200 people that her price was her price. He built her a new shed. That was his contribution, and it was, I think, exactly the right one. Not a house, a shed at the top end of the walk with a stove in it, so that she could work in weather that had previously stopped her. She laid rope on that flat for another 24 years. Effie Lund stayed 20 of them, and then went and started her own walk at Green River, with Verity Mullen's written method in her hand and Verity Mullen's blessing, which is not a thing that happens often in any trade. And the rope. Let me finish with the rope, because it is the only loose end. She never made another provably perfect coil. She said so when she was asked, which was not often. When men came out after 1890 and asked her to guarantee a rope the way she had guaranteed the one in the street, she told them the truth, that the stock that rope came from did not exist anymore. That what she could offer now was her method and her hands and her book, and that they would have to decide whether that was enough. It was. Every time. For 24 years. Which is, when you think about it, the whole point. And it took me a long while to see it. Because what actually changed in Sweetwater County was not that people started buying good rope. It was that people started asking, whose rope is this? What is in it? Where did the stock come from? Can you tell me? Once a county has learned to ask that question, it does not need a woman with 600 feet of perfect rope in a shed anymore. The question does the work, and the question is a great deal harder to use up than the rope was. She spent 120 feet of that coil in her whole life. 3 demonstrations, 1886, 1886, and the courthouse steps in 1889. The remaining 480 feet stayed in the shed, and it was still there when she died in 1921 at the age of 65, coiled and dry and untouched. And her will left it to the county. Nobody quite knew what to do with a bequest like that. It sat in a storeroom in the courthouse for a long time. There is a photograph, taken in the 1930s, of that coil hanging on the wall of the county office in a glass case with a small typed card under it. The card does not say what she did. It does not mention the fire or the 31 ropes or the 3 years and 2 months. Whoever typed it did not know any of that. And by the 30s, there was probably nobody left in that building who did. It says rope, made in this county, hand laid. And I think she would have thought that was about right, because that is what she had been trying to make true the entire time. Not that she was clever, and not that she had been wronged, though both of those things were the case. Just that somewhere in that county there should be one piece of rope that a person could point at and say what it was. That is the whole story. A woman that a store owner called too heavy in front of 11 people on a Tuesday in March 1887, who could have ended the argument any afternoon she liked for the price of 40 feet. And who understood better than anybody in Sweetwater County that the evidence was finite and the credibility was finite, and that spending either one in the wrong room spent it forever. Who watched 31 ropes part and one man lose the use of his wrist and said nothing. Who was offered $572 and turned it down, and was offered a 3-year contract and turned that down, and let the whole county think it was spite, because explaining would have cost more than the money was worth. Who left a broken rope hanging on a nail behind a harness shop when taking it would have proved everything, because taking it would have made her the woman who collects, and who then spent her last public demonstration not on winning, but on 200 men in a street finding out, all at the same moment, that they had not been careless after all. She gave 31 men their competence back for 40 feet of rope, and a lean, weathered rancher who had bought rope twice in his life and never wondered why it held stood on a public road with 14 head of oxen blowing behind him, and said, so that everybody could hear it, that he would pay what she asked and not a cent under. One woman who would not lay it faster. One man who did not buy rope twice.